Admiral Kexmora stood in front of the huge glowing map that floated in the air on her giant warship, called the Eternal Dominion. The map showed Earth spinning slowly like a small blue marble, surrounded by what was left of the human space fleet. To her alien eyes, it looked like a hurt animal waiting to die. Her ship was massive, bigger than most human cities. The walls were made of dark metal that seemed to absorb light, and strange symbols glowed along the corridors. The bridge where she stood was filled with screens and controls that her crew operated with hands that had too many fingers. "Give me the numbers," she said in her deep, rumbling voice. Commander Veltar walked up to her. He was tall and thin, with forearms that moved like spider legs as he pointed at the floating numbers above them. His skin was grey and covered in small scales that caught the light from the displays. "We have 10,000 ships, Admiral," he said, his voice making clicking sounds when he talked. "The humans, they only have 97 ships left that can still fight." Kexamora's jaw parts clicked together in what passed for a smile among her people. She had waited 3 years for this moment. 3 long years of chasing humans across the galaxy, destroying their cities on distant planets, crushing their armies and burning their space stations. The humans had been so proud when they first met her people. They thought they were ready to join the big galactic community. They had built nice ships and trained good soldiers. But they were young and stupid. They didn't understand that space was full of older, stronger races who didn't like sharing. Now look at them. Their beautiful colonies were nothing but floating rocks. Their military schools were empty ruins. Their factory worlds that used to build ships and weapons were silent and dark. All that was left was their home planet, and less than 100 beat-up ships. The math was simple and beautiful. 10,000 against 97. Her fleet could destroy every human ship and still have enough left over to wipe out a dozen more planets. It would be over in hours, maybe less. Far below on Earth, in a room buried so deep underground that the weight of rock above it could crush mountains, Captain Hyunwoo Kim sat at a desk covered in screens. The room was small and hot, filled with the sound of computers working and people talking quietly into headphones. This wasn't like the clean, bright command centers you see in movies. The walls were rough concrete, and the air smelled like electronics and recycled oxygen. Cables ran everywhere like metal snakes, and the only light came from hundreds of small screens showing numbers, maps, and video feeds from all over the solar system. Hyunwoo was young for a captain, maybe 35, with tired eyes and hands that shook slightly from too much coffee and not enough sleep. He had been living in this bunker for 2 years, ever since the aliens started winning the war. Lieutenant Soo-Jin Park sat at the station next to him, her fingers dancing over controls that looked nothing like normal military equipment. Some of the screens showed what looked like weather reports. Others had mining data or shipping schedules. Still others showed feeds from traffic cameras in cities around the world. "They're here," she said softly, not looking up from her screens. 10,000 ships, just like our spies said there would be." Hyunwoo nodded and reached for the radio that would connect him to people all over Earth and throughout the solar system. These weren't soldiers in the usual sense. They were teachers and doctors and engineers and shop owners. They were grandmothers and teenagers and office workers. "Send the signal to everyone," he said calmly. "Tell them it's time to show these aliens that counting ships isn't the same as counting what really matters." Up in space, the human fleet waited. Their ships looked terrible. Hulls patched with different colored metal, weapons that were clearly borrowed from other types of ships, and crews that were probably running on energy drinks and determination. To Admiral Kexmora's sensors, they looked exactly like what they were supposed to look like. The last, desperate stand of a species that had run out of options and time, but appearances, as the aliens were about to learn, could be very, very deceiving. The real human fleet wasn't made of ships at all. Space around Earth lit up like a deadly fireworks show, as 10,000 alien ships appeared all at once. They came out of hyperspace in rows so perfect, they looked like someone had drawn lines across the darkness with silver ink. Each ship was the size of a city block, covered in weapons that glowed with energy ready to kill. Admiral Kexmora stood on her command bridge, watching the tactical display that showed her fleet spreading out like a metal cloud. Everything was going exactly as planned. Her ships moved with the precision of a machine, each one knowing exactly where to go and what to do. But something was wrong. "Where are they?" she said quietly, her alien voice carrying a note of confusion that made her crew look up from their stations. The human fleet was just sitting there. 97 beat-up ships floating near Earth like they had given up before the fight even started. They weren't moving into defensive positions. They weren't trying to hide behind the Moon or Earth's orbital stations. They were just waiting. Commander Veltar bent over his instruments, his forearms working different controls at the same time. His grey skin had turned slightly blue, which meant he was confused or worried. "Admiral," he said slowly, "the humans appear to be waiting for us. This wasn't how space battles were supposed to work. When a fleet this big showed up, the defenders should be scrambling. They should be sending out desperate radio calls for help. They should be trying to run away or at least spreading out so they wouldn't all get killed at once. Instead, the human ships just floated there like they were taking a nap." Kexmora felt a cold feeling in her stomach. In 3 years of war, the humans had always surprised her. Not in good ways. They were stubborn and refused to surrender even when they should have. But they had never acted like this before. "Begin the attack," she ordered, pushing down her worry. Numbers didn't lie. 10,000 ships against 97. The math was still on her side. On the human ship Defiance, Commander Tae-Hyung Lee sat in his captain's chair, which was really just a regular chair with some extra screens bolted to the arms. The whole ship felt like it had been built by people who had to use whatever they could find, which was exactly what had happened. The Defiance had started life as a cargo ship that carried supplies between Earth and Mars. When the war started, the humans had welded weapons onto it and called it a warship. The walls were thin, the weapons were borrowed from other ships, and the whole thing shook when the engines ran too hard. But Tae-Hyung loved this ugly ship and its crew of mechanics, truck drivers, and college students who had volunteered to fight in space. "Here they come," said his communications officer, a woman who used to fix satellites for a living. The alien weapons fire hit them like a wall of lightning. The ship's hull screamed as metal bent and broke. Air started rushing out through holes that appeared in the walls. Warning lights flashed red everywhere, and the artificial gravity flickered on and off. "Engineering," Tae-Hyung shouted into his radio over the noise of explosions and emergency alarms. "Still here, sir," came the cheerful voice of engineer Min-Ho Choi from somewhere deep in the ship. Min-Ho sounded like he was having fun, which was probably because he was crazy. "We can take a lot more of this." The aliens watching from their perfect, deadly ships saw exactly what they expected to see. The human ship was breaking apart. Pieces of metal and machinery were flying off into space. Atmosphere was venting from a dozen holes. It looked like the Defiance would be dead in minutes. What they didn't see was that Min-Ho wasn't just trying to keep the ship running. He was conducting an orchestra, and every piece of debris that broke away from the ship was actually a musician waiting for their turn to play. Each chunk of metal that looked like broken ship parts was actually a small weapons platform. No, bigger than a refrigerator but packed with sensors, computers, and enough firepower to hurt something much bigger than itself. They were controlled by quantum communications that the aliens couldn't detect or jam, signals that moved faster than light and couldn't be intercepted. As the Defiance died, it was actually giving birth to dozens of hidden weapons that spread out into space, invisible to alien sensors, waiting for their moment. Admiral Kexmora watched her tactical display and frowned. Her ships were reporting small problems. Nothing serious, just minor course corrections needed to avoid floating debris. Space battles always created lots of wreckage, so this was normal, except the debris seemed to be moving in ways that didn't make sense. "Science officer," she called out. "Yes, Admiral," came the reply from a creature that looked like it was made of crystals and light. "The debris fields around the human ships, they're moving strangely, explain." The science officer studied its instruments for several long moments. "Admiral, I'm detecting gravitational anomalies. The debris appears to be affecting local space-time in impossible ways. Metal fragments shouldn't be able to do this." Kexmora stared at the display. Space junk didn't just move around by itself. It especially didn't move in patterns that looked almost organized. "It's not debris," she whispered, the truth hitting her like a cold wave. It was bait. and her fleet had just taken it. The battle had been going on for 2 hours, and Admiral Kexmora was starting to panic. Her ships kept shooting at the human fleet, blowing them apart piece by piece, but somehow the humans kept fighting. Back! It was like trying to kill a monster that grew new heads every time you cut one off. How? She screamed at her science officers, her voice echoing through the bridge. How are they still shooting at us? Her crew looked scared. These were beings who had conquered dozens of worlds, destroyed entire civilizations, and never lost a major battle. But now they were staring at their instruments with confusion and growing fear. Commander Veltar's forearms were shaking as he worked his controls. "Admiral, I'm picking up human communications. They're not encrypted. It's like they want us to hear them." "Put it on speakers," Kexmora ordered. The bridge filled with human voices talking in their strange, quick language. But the alien computers translated it instantly, and what they heard made no sense. "Mining Platform 7, this is Control. You're cleared to transform to combat mode. Cargo Container Group Delta, prepare for kinetic launch. Civilian Transport Morningstar, please reveal your weapon arrays now." Kexmora felt her blood turn cold. Mining platforms, cargo containers, civilian transports, these weren't military terms. "Science officer," she barked. "What does this mean?" The crystalline being at the science station worked frantically at its controls. After a moment, it looked up with what might have been terror in its glowing eyes. "Admiral," it said in a voice like breaking glass, "I don't think we're fighting their military. 3,000 kilometers away, on what the aliens had catalogued as Mining Platform 7, Engineer Dongwook Han stretched his arms and smiled. He had been living inside this hollowed-out asteroid for 3 years, waiting for this day. The asteroid looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a big chunk of rock with some mining equipment stuck to it. The aliens had scanned it dozens of times and seen nothing but iron ore and a few automated mining machines. What they hadn't seen was that the inside of the asteroid had been completely hollowed out and turned into a fortress. Dongwook and his team of 12 engineers had been living in there like underground dwarves, growing food in hydroponic gardens and getting supplies through secret tunnels that connected to other mining platforms. "All right, people," Dongwook announced to his crew. "Time to show these aliens what human stubbornness looks like." The side of the asteroid split open like a flower blooming, revealing massive cannons that had been built inside the rock. What had looked like a simple mining operation was actually a weapons platform more powerful than most alien battleships. All across the solar system, the same thing was happening. Cargo containers that had been floating in space for years suddenly opened up to reveal they were packed with missiles. Space stations that were supposed to be manufacturing civilian goods turned out to be weapons factories that had been making ammunition for decades. Even the civilian ships were fake. The Morning Star looked like a simple passenger transport that carried people between Earth and Mars. But when Captain Ji-Un-Yoon pressed a button on her control panel, the ship's hull split apart to reveal enough firepower to level a city. "This is Morning Star," she announced cheerfully over the radio. "We are no longer a passenger ship. We are now a very angry weapons platform. Please stand by for violence." Admiral Kexmora watched her tactical display with growing horror as the truth became clear. Every piece of metal in the solar system, every asteroid, every space station, every floating chunk of debris was suddenly revealing itself to be a weapon pointed at her fleet. "They've militarized everything," whispered Commander Veltar. "Admiral, they haven't just built a military. They've turned their entire civilization into a weapon. The humans had been planning this for decades. While the aliens thought they were destroying human military bases, the humans were actually building new ones inside things that looked harmless. Every rock that floated in space, every piece of space junk, every civilian structure had been secretly turned into a fortress. It wasn't just the big stuff either. Cargo containers became missiles that could punch through alien armor. Communication satellites turned out to be spy networks that had been watching the alien fleet for years. Even the space garbage that every civilization creates was actually carefully placed weapons waiting for their moment. The aliens had superior numbers, better technology, and more experience. But the humans had something else. They had turned being stubborn into an art form. Instead of building bigger ships, they had made everything into a ship. Instead of training better soldiers, They had made every person in the solar system into a soldier. Instead of creating stronger weapons, they had made the entire universe around Earth into one giant weapon. Admiral Kexmora realized with growing dread that her fleet of 10,000 ships wasn't fighting 97 human vessels. They were fighting against an entire star system where literally everything was trying to kill them. The math had been perfect, 10,000 against 97. But the humans had changed what the numbers meant. 3 kilometers beneath Seoul, Captain Hyunwoo Kim stood in front of a wall covered in screens, showing the battle raging above Earth. His underground command center looked like something from a science fiction movie, but it smelled like coffee and fear. Hundreds of people sat at workstations that had been built into what used to be subway tunnels. These weren't soldiers in uniforms. They were regular people, teachers, mechanics, computer programmers, even some teenagers who were really good at video games. For 5 years they had been preparing for this moment while pretending to live normal lives. "Status report," Hyunwoo said quietly. "All gravity generators are online," reported engineer Yoo-jin Kang from her station. She was a small woman who used to design bridges before the war started. Now she controlled weapons that could bend space itself. On the screens they could see the alien fleet hanging in space like a silver cloud. The ships were arranged in perfect geometric patterns, rows and columns that looked like a textbook example of military formation. It was beautiful in a deadly way. "The aliens love their formations," Hyunwoo said with a cold smile. "Let's see how much they love them when we turn physics against them." He picked up the radio that connected him to secret installations all over the solar system. "All stations, this is Control. Execute Operation Mousetrap now." Yoo-jin Kang's fingers danced over her controls. For 5 years, her team had been secretly building what they called gravity generators, inside structures that the aliens thought were simple mining operations. The aliens had scanned these installations hundreds of times and saw only boring industrial equipment. What they hadn't realized was that the humans had been learning to manipulate gravity itself. "Activating gravity wells," Yoo-jin announced. 3, 2, 1. Mark. In space, invisible forces suddenly grabbed hold of the alien fleet like giant hands. The Kexvar ships, arranged in their perfect formations, felt their engines fighting against pull they couldn't see or understand. Admiral. Kexmora was thrown sideways as her massive ship lurched like a car hitting ice. Warning alarms started screaming throughout the bridge as her navigation officer shouted numbers that didn't make sense. "We're being pulled off course," the officer yelled. "Gravitational anomaly detected. Source unknown." "Emergency maneuvers," Kexmora screamed, her voice cracking with panic. "All ships break formation and scatter." But it was too late. The humans had spent years studying the aliens' favorite battle formations. They knew exactly how the enemy liked to arrange their ships, and they had built their trap accordingly. The gravity wells weren't pulling the ships in random directions, they were pulling them toward each other. Commander Veltar watched his instruments, in horror as the tactical display showed their perfect formation turning into a disaster. Ships that had been flying in neat rows were now being dragged into collision courses with their own allies. "Admiral," he shouted, "the gravity fields are artificial. The humans have weaponized space-time itself." The beautiful formation that had been the Kexvar fleet's greatest strength became their worst nightmare. Ships crashed into each other with the force of small meteors. The tight groupings that had made them so efficient now meant that when one ship was pulled off course, it dragged others with it. Yoo-jin Kang watched the chaos on her screens and allowed herself a small smile. "Looks like they're having some trouble with their math," she said. But the gravity weapons were just the beginning. All across Earth and throughout the solar system, structures that had been hiding in plain sight for decades suddenly revealed their true nature. What the aliens had catalogued as the Seoul General Hospital had actually been a command center all along. The patients were real, the doctors were real, but the basement levels that didn't show up on any public blueprints were full of military computers and communication equipment. Dr. Min Jung Park, who really was a doctor, pressed a hidden button in her office. The hospital's roof slid open to reveal a massive communication array that immediately started coordinating attacks across the entire solar system. "This is Sol Command," she announced over hidden radio channels. "All installations are go for full reveal. Time to show them what we've really been building." The Busan Elementary School had been teaching real children for years, but the school's basement was actually a tactical coordination center run by teachers who used to be military officers. When Principal Jae-won Lee activated his hidden systems, the playground equipment folded away to reveal satellite dishes and sensor arrays. Even the factories were fake. The Samsung Electronics manufacturing plant really did make phones and computers, but it also made missiles. When the order came, the assembly lines that had been building consumer goods for years suddenly started launching weapons into space. Admiral Kexmora stared at her tactical display in disbelief. Every civilian structure on Earth was revealing, itself to be a military installation. It was like watching a magician's trick, but instead of pulling rabbits out of hats, the humans were pulling weapons out of everything. "How long?" she whispered. "How long have they been planning this?" Commander Veltar consulted his intelligence files with shaking hands. "Admiral, our records show that some of these installations have been in place for over 20 years. They've been preparing for this war since before they even knew we existed. The humans hadn't just built a military to fight the aliens. They had made their entire civilization into a weapon. Every person was a soldier. Every building was a fortress. Every piece of technology was part of a vast machine designed for one purpose: to turn the aliens' own strength against them. The math that had seemed so perfect, 10,000 ships against 97, suddenly meant nothing. The humans had changed the rules of the game entirely. They weren't fighting a battle. They were watching the aliens destroy themselves. 3 weeks after the disaster at Earth, Admiral Kexamora sat alone in her small quarters aboard the ship Broken Promise. The name felt like a cruel joke now. She had promised the Hegemony High Command that humanity would be extinct within days. Instead, she was one of only 300 survivors from a fleet of 10,000 ships. Her quarters were dark, except for the soft glow from her personal computer, where she was writing the report that would end her military career. Through the small window next to her desk, she could see the stars, the same stars that had once seemed like stepping stones to conquest. Now they looked different somehow, threatening. As if each point of light might be hiding another species like the humans, the report had to be written no matter what it would cost her. The hegemony needed to understand what had happened here, or they might make the same mistake again. "Personal log Admiral Kexmora, final battle report," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. The recording device sat on her desk like a judge waiting to hear her confession. "The numerical analysis provided by our intelligence division was completely accurate," she continued, choosing her words carefully. "We outnumbered their military vessels 100 to 1. Our weapons were superior. Our tactics were proven. Our strategy was flawless." She paused, staring at her reflection in the dark window. The alien looking back at her seemed older, broken somehow. However, this analysis proves meaningless when applied to humans. We counted ships. They counted something else entirely. On Earth, 3 kilometers beneath Seoul, Captain Hyun-woo Kim finally climbed the long staircase that led from his underground command center to the surface. He hadn't seen real sunlight in 2 years, and it hurt his eyes when he stepped outside. The city around him looked almost normal. People were walking on the sidewalks, cars were driving down the streets, and children were playing in the parks. If you didn't know what to look for, you might never guess that this entire city had just finished fighting a space battle. Engineer Soo-jin Park was standing near the entrance to their bunker, talking on a radio and holding a clipboard. She had changed out of her military uniform and was wearing the simple clothes of a city engineer, which is what she had been before the war and what she would be again now that it was over. "How's the cleanup going?" Hyun-woo asked, stretching muscles that were sore from sitting in underground command centers for too long. "Pretty good," Soo-jin replied, checking items off her list. "The gravity generators are being shut down and converted back to their civilian purposes. The hidden weapon platforms are being dismantled. Most of the fake mining asteroids are being turned back into actual mining operations. Around them, the city was transforming again. The teachers who had been running spy networks were going back to their classrooms. The doctors who had been coordinating military communications were returning to their hospitals. The mechanics who had been operating hidden weapons were going back to fixing cars and trucks. It was like watching a magic trick in reverse. The military machine that had defeated an alien invasion was disappearing, leaving behind what looked like an ordinary city full of ordinary people. Think they'll be back? Sujin asked, looking up at the sky where pieces of alien ships were still falling like shooting stars. Hyunwoo shook his head slowly. Would you come back to fight a planet where every person is a soldier and every building might be a fortress, where the elementary school playground could turn into a missile launcher and the hospital could be running the entire defense network? Back on her ship, Admiral Kexmora continued her report. The words were coming easier now, like poison finally being drained from an infected wound. The humans do not separate their military from their civilian population the way civilized species do, she said. Every human in their solar system participated in the defense. We intercepted communications from children as young as 12 operating sensor networks. Engineers became artillery crews. Scientists became military strategists. Teachers became spies. Even their elderly were running supply networks. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the stars that no longer seemed friendly. They weaponized their entire species, Admiral. Not just their technology, not just their military, but their entire way of thinking. For them, there is no difference between a soldier and a civilian, between a weapon and a tool, between war and daily life. On Earth, the transformation was almost complete. The massive military operation that had defeated the alien invasion was melting away like snow in spring. In a few months, there would be almost no trace of it left. The humans were very good at hiding their preparations. Captain Hyunwoo Kim walked through the streets of Seoul, watching people return to their normal lives. The woman selling flowers on the corner had been operating a communication relay station during the battle. The man fixing a broken streetlight had been coordinating asteroid defense platforms. The teenagers playing basketball in the park had been running computer programs that helped target alien ships. None of them looked like soldiers. None of them acted like they had just won the greatest military victory in human history. They just looked like people living their lives. That, Hyunwoo realized, was exactly the point. Admiral Kexmora finished her report with words that she knew would haunt her for the rest of her life. Recommendation to High Command: immediate and permanent cessation of all hostilities with the human species. We counted their ships and calculated certain victory. They counted everything else and redefined the meaning of war itself. She paused, remembering something that had puzzled her during the battle preparation. Final note: we intercepted human communications before the battle began. They were laughing. At the time we assumed this was hysteria or madness brought on by fear. We now understand that we were wrong. She turned off the recording device and stared out at the stars. They weren't afraid of us. They were eager to show us what they could do. The universe suddenly seemed like a much more dangerous place.